celebrate what's right with the world. The spiritual theme I wanted to take today is one on faith, and kind of along the lines, if you believe it, you'll see it. And what kind of inspired me more for this is thing of Pope Benedict and his writings from his young age to his older age. And I'm going to begin with a quote that comes from his last testament. So he did an interesting thing. This was in 2007. So dated August 29, 2006. So at that time, you know, he died in 2022. He's 95 years old. And so maybe he's like 82 years old. 2006, he just become Pope. And he became Pope in 2005. And for spiritual exercise, he wrote what he would call a spiritual testament, kind of his last words he wanted people to know. And it was kind of amazing. He got to the end, and he wrote in this paragraph, I'll read the first paragraph and last paragraph, but he said, "When at this late hour of my life, I look back on the decades I've wandered through, I see first of all how much reason I have to give thanks. Above all, I thank God himself, the giver of all good gifts, who has given me life and guided me through all kinds of confusion, who has always picked me up when I began to slip, who has always given me anew the light of his countenance. In retrospect, I see and understand that even the dark and arduous stretches of this path were for my salvation, and that he guided me well in those very stretches." And then he goes kind of listing thankfulness to, going back to his parents, his homeland, a lot of gratitude. And then he says, "What I said earlier, my compatriots, I now say to all who are entrusted to my service in the church, stand firm in the faith. Do not be confused. For 60 years now, I have accomplished the path of theology, especially biblical studies, and have seen seemingly unshakable theses collapse with the changing generations, which turned out to be mere hypotheses. The liberal generation, Harnack-Ulicker, the existentialist generation, Bultmann, etc., the Marxist generation. I have seen and see how out of the tangle of hypotheses, the reasonableness of faith has emerged and is emerging anew. Jesus Christ is truly the way, the truth, and the life, and the church, in all her shortcomings, is truly his body." Now, this is a man in his 80s, looking back on his life and reflecting on all that he had learned. And it says, I use that thing like memory as we look back and review our life, that his faith guided looking back on his past. His faith and belief in Jesus Christ. And so he was able to say in the 80s, I even thank God for the hard times. Because when we're going through them, they're terrible. But looking back on it, he could say, I learned the way to salvation. I learned God's goodness at each step. So I want to share with you today are just some reflections about Pope Benedict, kind of his life, and some things that have stood out for me over the years that have helped me from his writing and his background. As a background, two things. One is the first story I ever heard about Pope Benedict, a personal story, was when I was a young priest. I was a parochial vicar of a parish. I'm from Houston. I was in Spring, Texas, in the parish of Spring. And we had our ecumenical group with the rabbi and, disciples of Christ, Baptists. All of us would meet and talk about the faith. And so one day the Methodist bishop was visiting. It was like 1994. And the Methodist bishop was visiting, and he looked at me and he said, Father, have you met Cardinal Ratzinger? And I told him, let me tell you about the Catholic Church. I'm a parochial vicar. I report to a pastor. I said, I'm never going to be Cardinal Ratzinger. I mean, he said, then he told me, he said, I had lunch with him a couple weeks ago. So first impressions, some affirm his faith, but his personality, what the Methodist Bishop of Texas said was he's very personable. He said, you know, we got to meet, we're talking about Catholics and Methodists, what unites us, and trying to work for a greater union. And he took time to listen to him. And so his personality must be very simple and open to people, and trying to draw a greater union for the Christian faith.